So a lot of what intelligent nonconformity is about is realizing, all right, well, I'm living in a modern, anonymous society. It's very different from the one that human beings evolved in, which means there's an enormous range within which I can just live my own life, march the beat of my own drummer, and nothing bad will ever happen to me. But I do need to keep my eyes open for counterexamples to that rule. So anything that impinges on the labor market, that's one where you got to be more careful.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Bryan Caplan, a professor of economics at George Mason University. Bryan is the author of a number of books, including my personal favorite, The Case Against Education. And I really wanted to have Bryan on the show because he has a very interesting perspective as someone who is a staunch critic of the education system in America as we know it, but who at the same time is deeply entrenched inside that system as a university professor. And Bryan's also a self-described nonconformist, which we talk about in detail late in the episode. But at the same time, he thinks like an economist in terms of the cost-benefit analysis of where and when to be a nonconformist versus where it's strategic to be a conformist. And we talk about that line of thinking in today's episode at great length in discussing the merits of a college degree and whether it is useful for the average student to take the college path as a mechanism for launching their career. Bryan and I debate this extensively on today's episode. He and I talk about the pros and cons of whether or not it is important for a young person to get a degree. For those of you who have listened to the show, you know that I take a very strong stance against the degree and a very strong stance in favor of taking the path less traveled. And Bryan makes a lot of compelling arguments for why it is important to think about the signaling mechanism of the degree on the market and why that is perhaps a hard thing to overcome for many different career paths. We also talk about Bryan's experience as a college professor. We talk about the incredible inefficiency in how we are funding education in America and why we are grossly overspending for the product that we're receiving. We talk about how to think about the costs and benefits of exiting the status quo education system at various points along a student's journey. And we talk about Bryan's forthcoming book, which is about nonconformity. I really enjoyed speaking with Bryan, and I hope you enjoy listening to this episode. Bryan Caplan, welcome to the podcast.
Fantastic to be here.
I'm so excited to have you here. Your book, The Case Against Education, was one of the books that was very influential in the early days of Praxis, which was very influential in the early days of my career. So it feels very fitting to have you here in the early days of the show talking about education. There's so much that I want to ask you about. You have such an interesting perspective as somebody who is a college professor but is speaking out or writing about the problems in education and making cases against them. So there's a lot here that I want to dig into. But I want to start, this was a spicy take a few years ago. I feel like it's not quite as spicy as it used to be. It's like it's sort of catching on now, the fact that a college degree does not mean all that it used to. But I want to talk a little bit about the deflation of the college degree.
Okay.
And the idea that a college degree does not mean what it used to. And
all right,
that
sure.
the value is perhaps not if the underlying assumption of how most people educate their children is that they want them to be able to get into a good college if they so choose so that they can get a good job. The idea that is no longer a guaranteed path towards success.
Right. Of course, it was never a guaranteed path to success. That's just parental lies if they would ever tell you something like that. I'd say it's very important always to distinguish two different ways of measuring a degree. One is what do you know, and the other one is how much money do you make as a result of getting that degree. I will say there's been a lot of decline in how much a college graduate generally knows. It's pretty clear because we can just see that the IQ of college graduates is just going down, 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 down. And why? Well, because we let more and more people in. So when standards get lower, then the people that get over the standards aren't as good. But if you're looking at the financial payoffs, That's one where I'll still say we are close to the all-time peak. I think in the very latest data, there's a little bit of decline. But when people say the college degree doesn't help you in the labor market as much as it did, say it's not clear that that is true in terms of just the raw difference in earnings between people with college degrees and only of high school. Probably peaked at about a 73% premium. I think the very latest data, maybe it's dipped down to like 65%. Even that, I would hesitate to go and say this shows that the tide has turned rather than random variation. I'm someone who's picky about drawing trend lines, and I'll say, look, I want to see a trend that's gone on for 10 years before I say it's a trend. Otherwise, it could be a blip.
I have to ask the obvious question, which is how much of this is correlation versus causation of the types of people who go to college who would have the proclivity to earn higher anyway in their careers? Like, is the degree actually, in your opinion, and I know this may be hard to pull data about, but in your opinion, is the degree actually the factor that's causing them to, these individuals to have higher earnings? Or is there more correlation here than one might guess at first glance?
This is probably the most studied question in the entire field of economics of education. And what I'll say is essentially 100% of all people who've looked at the data, no matter how skeptically, have come away and said a large chunk of the apparent effect of education on income is causal. Real, genuine, bona fide effect. The range of how much of it is not causal varies a lot. Nobel Prize winning economist David Card, my teacher, is famous or maybe infamous for saying 100% causal. What you see is what you get. I, in the case against education, go over a lot of that evidence, and I say that I think that it's not even really cherry picking. It's more like saying a whole bunch of cherries don't count and are not real evidence. So I do think that if you look at all the evidence that is out there, it is very reasonable still to say that 60 to 70% of that gap is causal. But then the real question of the case against education is, all right, fine, we've got this causal part, but why is it causal? And that is a totally separate question. The usual view that people have is, well, once I show it's causal, then it's clearly because you're acquiring useful skills. The point of my book is to say there's another kind of causation. It's stamp on your forehead causation, where because you've got the stamp, that actually causes you to make more money, but it's not because you were improved, rather it's because you were certified. As I say whenever I'm giving this talk in a Spanish-speaking country, it's because you've got las estampas. You've got the stamps on your forehead.
So the gap in earnings is primarily caused by the fact that you are perceived as being more valuable in the labor market because you have the degree. It's not actually about anything meaningful that you learned in the 4 years in university.
Well, what I say is that it's a mix, but yes, a large majority of it is the stamp. And in the book, I just go over what I consider all the different kinds of evidence that should convince you of that. Ultimately, I think the really best kind of evidence is just to open your eyes and look at what people study in school and then compare it to what they do on the job, and then just tell me with a straight face that what they learn in school is what they need to know for the job. It's just not true. Most of what you learn in school is irrelevant in the real world. You can safely forget it right after the final exam. The only save is to say, okay, well, sure, you don't go and use your knowledge of the Civil War in your banking job, but you learned how to think when you were studying the Civil War. And that is, again, where I will say there's a whole field called educational psychology where they try to measure these kinds of learning how to learn effects or critical thinking effects. They are highly ideologically and personally disposed to want to believe in these effects. And even they hardly ever believe these effects are real or at least notable. So yeah, it's not what people tell you as propaganda, not parents, not teachers, not politicians. So what I say is the best estimate is 80% of that causal payoff is from las estampas.
And what's the other 20%? Like, what actually is valuable that you're getting in the educational side?
Yeah, so some of it is actually learning reading and writing and stuff like that. Some of it is field specific, like you go and you get your CS degree and that teaches you to do CS. It's an average, which means that some fields are pulling the average up as others are dragging the average down. So yeah, so the engineers, the STEM people are usually, not always, pulling that average of actual skill acquisition up. Other fields are pulling it down. So yeah, I'd say there's that. And also, I think this is more for K-12 than for college. The idea that you're getting some kind of character building when you make people go and sit down, shut up, do as they're told. Yeah, that's actually a big part of life. hate to say it, I'm a nonconformist, but still, there's no I in team. You do need people to get with the program. I think for K-12, at least, until recently, they did a reasonable job of making people march around and follow orders. But for a very long time, I'd say it's very odd to think of college as teaching good character for job purposes, because it's a lot of dysfunctional, you're a beautiful and unique snowflake, you shouldn't have to do anything you don't want. And also, you just don't work that many hours. We've got good data on how much time college students spend actually doing academic work of any kind. Back in the 60s, college was basically a full-time job during the 30 weeks that you're there at school anyway. But now it's more like a part-time job. It's more like 25 hours a week on average, and that average conceals a bunch of people who are barely doing anything, don't even show up to class.
Yeah. So I want to break this down, like how to think about this for parents who are, and also for young people who are grappling with this conundrum that college is extremely expensive, and yet it's extremely efficient, and yet it also seems to be directly correlated to lifetime earnings. So there's this struggle that I think a lot of people go through, and I was in these shoes. So,
well, let's break that down a little bit. So on the extreme expense, one of the main myths that I think confuses people is thinking that the list price on the website is what you're really going to pay. That's normally not true. Now, if you are in the elite, then you probably are in that tiny minority of people who are paying list price. So if your family's rich, then you might talk to a bunch of other rich people and you think that the Harvard list price is what most people really pay. Typical student at Harvard is paying way less, actually, and that is true for most good schools. So out-of-pocket cost tends to actually to be exaggerated by most people. Most people are not paying anything close to that. Most people are not going to elite schools anyway. And then in terms of the efficiency, no, it's terribly inefficient. It's just that it's a super subsidized, inefficient thing, and the subsidies make it your best choice personally, but that doesn't mean the system is anything less than a giant, colossal waste of money. It's to be there and to say, this is efficiency. If that's efficiency, what the hell is inefficiency?
But it is, even if you're not paying the sticker price, it's still a lot of money on average that students don't have. They're coming out of high school. They're effectively broke. They're going into debt. I know so many young people who are carrying college debt into their 30s and beyond because they're paying for a degree that it's
well,
not.
You might remember during COVID, they cut off payments, and the last time I checked, they still hadn't resumed, and we had a pile of inflation. So yeah, I am sort of taking out my violin for those people and saying, look, you borrowed a ton of subsidized money. You haven't had to make payments in 3 years, more now, right? And there's been a bunch of inflation eroding the real value of that debt. So I would say those people are actually made a killing. It's been a good.
But that's not necessarily a guarantee for a family that's making a decision in present tense about what to do with college.
That is correct.
And it's disconcerting to think about if it is 80%, 80% of the value of your degree is just the sticker, the stamp.
Yep.
And that has a pretty significant correlation or causation on lifetime earnings. It's a tough decision whether or not to pull the trigger and go to school. And there's also, we can get into this perhaps later in the conversation. There are all of the other factors on what's being taught in school and the value of that, and if it's even a culture that you want to be exposed to or would enjoy being in. So there's a lot of factors at play. And I was, I did not go to college. I went and worked for Praxis instead, which I know you're very familiar with. And it felt like this was 2015 that I graduated from high school and decided not to go to school. And it felt like I was taking a shot in the dark. I didn't know if anybody would ever hire me, and I didn't know if I was going to be okay. And I had to really, weigh the pros and cons of it. And I think there's a lot more resources out there now than there used to be about things to do instead. But I really want to break down, it's not a binary one or the other, that either you're going to go to college and you're going to have this increase in lifetime earnings, or you're not going to go to college and you're going to be doomed to a lower income bracket for your entire life. There are ways to get around it. Even though this is sort of these are the standard two options on the playing field, there are lots and lots of people who are deviating from the normal path, but are still having these high lifetime earnings. They're being very successful in their career. And so I want to talk about what are the workarounds to, okay, I don't have the stamp, but I can prove on the job market that I'm a valuable person to employ and that I am worth a high price to have on board someone's team. How do you think about that?
Yeah. Here's the thing. If you've already got a lot of experience and connections, then I think that you can do great.
Mm-hmm.
But if you are right out of high school, then it's very tough. And this is what I talk to Isaac about a lot. What I would say is that if you are a real go-getter, if you're someone that will talk to people cold, right? You will just go and form plans and then cold email strangers and try to contact them and get help out of them.
Mm-hmm.
If you're that kind of a person, then I think you can pull it off. But on the other hand, if you're shy, if you are nervous, if you just don't have direction, then the regular system is probably better for you. Unless, of course, you have so little direction that you won't even show up to your classes. In that case, I don't really know how to help people that are too lazy to show up at classes. That's like at a level where it's like, I don't want to hire that person. Like, why? So I could go and try to give you advice for how you could trick someone else into thinking that you would be such a good person. I mean, in terms of the binary choice in college, I mean, I would say that really you should also, even if you're at college, there are a bunch of majors where the lifetime earnings you should expect to get from them are very low, even if you finish. And there's also just low completion rates. So, even within that, I'd be thinking about, well, what am I going to major in? Where am I actually going to be going to school? So there's that too. But if you want to really beat the system, obviously, if you have a very entrepreneurial personality, you've got your own ideas, you've got products, if you've got something people actually want, then you don't need me. If you're sort of at the edge of maybe I do, because my advice would probably be to start in high school and just see where it goes. And if things aren't taking off for you, to say, well, maybe I need to go and first go and pay my dues doing it the normal way and then branch off. Obviously, that's what most entrepreneurs do today is they first do the normal thing and then they use their degree as their passport to a real job. They get experience, they make connections, and then from there they go and they actually start a business. And this is one of the main issues with people starting businesses is you need to know what you're doing first. You might imagine that you've got it all figured out, and maybe a few people do, but most people need to start off following before they're ready to lead. It's just true.
So it sounds like you're describing a binary of either you're going to go into entrepreneurship or the status quo path is
well, if you want to
correct.
get rich, I mean, again, of course, you might say, well, is being a podcaster entrepreneurial? And I say, well, if you're your own boss, then yeah, that's pretty entrepreneurial. In terms of other things you might do, I'm guessing there's not a lot of people thinking about doing technical school that are listening to this. But if you are, then yeah, that is a option that is different from either of those. There are a bunch of skilled trades, normally learned through apprenticeships, or even better, if you can just learn it as a kid or as a teen through your family, that's better than that. And yeah, a lot of those actually pay quite well, and you then have no need to ever do college.
There was a lot of talk, especially a few years ago, about the idea of the college bubble, that it was getting very expensive, that it wasn't the returns were not there anymore. Going to college does not guarantee that you're going to get a good job because the market is just so saturated with people with degrees. There was the mimetic idea of the liberal arts major working at Starbucks, paying off their debts. What is your take on the future of higher education? Do you think that there's a bubble that is going to burst? Do you think that there is a change that is happening in terms of who is going to go to college, how many people are going to go to college, or do you think the momentum in the current direction is strong enough that it's just going to carry on?
Yeah, so for over 10 years, I've been saying it's not a bubble, it's stable waste, which is a different thing.
Can you explain what that means?
Stable waste is when it's a terrible system that's going to just continue indefinitely. A bubble, on the other hand, the whole idea is that it's not stable and it's going to get a dramatic change. I have a whole series of bets with people about the share of young people that will remain in traditional four-year college. And I've been winning all these bets. Each time there's usually a 10-year delay, which is an even bigger delay because it takes a while for the data to come out. But I've won all the bets. The share of people that are going to four-year colleges does fluctuate a little bit. And anytime it ticks down, there's people ready to go and cry victory, but it ticks back up again. There was a lot of data about how the share of kids going to college is crashing. Almost all of that change is based upon community college, which I never bet on because I just think that it's, a lot of people go, but it's like such well, first of all, it's just barely studied. But second of all, it's one where it's Seems to me it's mostly just about, well, I didn't get into any four-year college. My parents say either get a job or go to college, so I'll do community college. And so it's easier for something like that to have a crash when suddenly there's a whole lot of jobs for people that are doing Uber Eats during COVID. So I think that's most of what happened then. The main thing, so people keep thinking it's going to be like Napster crushing the record companies. They think, well, there's all this free online education or really cheap online education. How can traditional four-year colleges compete with it? What I keep saying is there's a difference. Namely, the record companies were supported by paying consumers, whereas the colleges are heavily, often primarily either subsidized by government and by donors. So bottom line, not a bubble, stable waste, system's bad. It's going to continue until that funding comes down.
Okay, so there are a couple pieces of this that I find very interesting that I want to dig into a little bit. The first is, what are there drivers at play that will change this trajectory? Like, we're on a very stable course, and there are very large financial resources coming into the university system that are not likely to be swayed by the ebbs and flows of the labor market or the ebbs and flows of even the perhaps reticence on a consumer level around the university system. So the universities are able to carry on as expected. What are the factors at play that would change the trajectory of this?
If voters actually decided they weren't getting their money's worth and started voting for people who said they were going to spend less, that would make a huge difference. That is an ultra unpopular view. Hardly anyone believes that. You might say, well, isn't that the right-wing view? It's like, no. The right-wing view is to be less completely convinced that we should spend a lot more money on education. That's different from actually wanting to spend less. If donors were to go and cut off money, that would make a lot of difference too. Of course, they've got a big pile of money, but if no new money came in, that would matter. In terms of other things, I mean, we did see one big effect during COVID, which is that when wages for people that are just willing to go and do in-person jobs suddenly goes up a lot, then a lot of marginal students don't go to college. And usually these were people in community college that just said, hey, why do I need to go and do community college in English when I can go and make $25 an hour doing deliveries or something like that? So that was a big change. So labor market does matter. And if you've got high-paid jobs for people who don't have college degrees, especially young people who are highly able-bodied and ready to ride around on a bike or something, then that made a big difference too. But COVID ends, and then things tend to go back to normal on that front. But yeah, so I'd say ultimately it has a lot to do with government money, donor money. Indirectly, there is the labor market. But the main thing we've just seen is that the labor market does still highly value college degrees relative to not having them. Now, people who know the data will generally say, well, wait a second, a lot of what's going on is just the people who don't have the degrees are doing worse. It's like, yeah, well, but in terms of what's a good strategy for you, it doesn't really matter why the premium is so large for college. It just matters that it's like, well, I've got one option that doesn't seem so great, which is pay all this money for college, and I got another option that seems really bad. Of course, if you are a super entrepreneurial, outgoing person with great ideas, then you may be able to write your own rules.
I'm going to push back just a little bit. I'd love to hear your pushback to my argument against this, because when I decided not to go to college, I really had no clue what I was going to do. And I found Praxis very early on in the journey and started working for them.
So you were not one of their clients. You were an employee.
Yes, which is a common misconception. People because Praxis is a very interconnected ecosystem. So people who go through the program, I had dinner 2 nights ago with somebody who was visiting in town, who was in the very first Praxis class. We're a very interconnected world. And he was introducing me to somebody as a Praxis participant. And I was like, no, I wasn't, but everybody thinks I was. I hacked Praxis. So they were, people paid them to help them land jobs. I started working for Praxis instead. I was an intern, and I was just like a very stubborn intern forever and just like wouldn't leave. And eventually they gave me a real job. So I worked for them for years, but I got effectively the Praxis experience because when I was interning for them, I was also going through the program effectively. Like I was doing all of the educational side of things and learning as much as I could. But I came up in an ecosystem where nobody had a college degree. And
really? So
Yeah.
what was your ecosystem?
Well, it was, no, I mean, inside of praxis.
Oh, inside of praxis.
Yeah, inside of praxis.
Right,
Although
so
I was homeschooled, so I also,
okay.
I was from a very non-traditional education background to begin with.
Were you homeschooled in a family that had not gone to college?
No,
or?
both my parents had degrees, but neither of them were using
All right,
them.
so you're just what I would expect.
Yeah, no, within praxis, I was in an
Yes.
ecosystem where almost everybody was degreeless.
Mm-hmm.
And not everybody wanted to be an entrepreneur. There were a lot of people who they had enough of the type of gumption that gives you the tolerance to withstand a startup environment. So they were tolerant of being around entrepreneurs, which is also that's its own personality class. Someone who can stand that type of environment, even if they don't want to be the one front running it. But a lot of them didn't want to be entrepreneurs. A lot of them, they're many years into their career now. They've never started a business. They've always worked in support roles for other companies. But there was always this really deep awareness that if you can signal your value in some way on the job market, then an employer doesn't actually care if you have a degree. They care if you can do the work, and the degree is a proxy for your ability to do the work. But if you can show them that you can do the things they want you to do on the job, they have no problem hiring you, generally speaking, especially startups and companies. There's the whole, some of the FANG companies were removing their requirements for degrees and hiring, and that was a big deal a few years ago. There's been a lot of movement, it seems, in the labor market towards being much more friendly towards people that don't have degrees and much more open to considering them as
so
employees.
my sense is that it's almost totally rhetorical, and they may officially remove it, but in terms of the number of people without degrees they're hiring for good jobs, it's really low. Sometimes I've even done discussions where the person on the other side is an entrepreneur saying, we entrepreneurs, we don't care about degrees, we just care about hard skills. I'm like, okay, so how many uncredentialed people do you employ for your high skilled jobs? Like, well, none of us, but in the Wall Street Journal I read, so you're not really speaking from any kind of firsthand experience. You're repeating something you heard in the media. Not impressed.
You're saying me.
No. I'm saying,
okay.
yes. No,
because
no, not you, Hannah.
I thought, I thought you were pushing back on my entire argument. I'm just clarifying which parts you're pushing back on. Okay, because within the praxis ecosystem and a lot of the other people, when I say the ecosystem, I mean more broadly than just people who did praxis. Like attracts like. You go out into the world, and you meet a lot of people from non-traditional backgrounds. Many of them are thriving. And so it seems to me, my pushback is that it seems like it's less of a binary than just you go to college or you become an entrepreneur. It seems like there's a lot more gray area that one can play in if one is willing to adopt. Like, it really seems like just a mentality thing. Like, if you understand the rules of the game that's being played in the broader world, where like what people are looking for that the degree represents, and what makes you both attractive to somebody who's hiring for a job in the first place, but then once you have some experience under your belt, how to think about leveraging that for the next opportunity and being the driving force instead of just waiting for someone else to come around and give you a promotion. If you understand those two things, there's suddenly a very large playing field in the gray area that I've watched many people navigate quite effectively. Who aren't particularly entrepreneurial. So I'm curious to hear your take on that too.
Yeah, I mean, that seems totally reasonable. I mean, really, we should be as non-binary as possible on these things. It's a there's a continuum, right? There's a continuum of how entrepreneurial you are. There's everybody from just zero all the way up to infinity. There's a continuum for how comfortable you are with that kind of thing. So if I gave the impression that either you are or you aren't, that's wrong. But I would say you still need to be quite high. I would say maybe like 90th percentile, 95th percentile of the general population. If you say, well, those people are just sheep anyway, so it's really easy to be a lot more entrepreneurial than them, fine.
You're saying 90 to 95th percentile in terms of proclivity towards entrepreneurship?
Yeah, and comfort with this kind of, you got to figure out how to make your own way in the world. There isn't, you don't just go and do what other people are doing and see.
Do you think, I'm sorry, I'm going to interject really quickly because I actually think this is important to drill into. How much of that do you think is nature versus nurture? Because we, from a very small age, we send kids to a place where it is implied that there are rules that you just have to learn and follow, that some authority figure inside of the system, they dictate where you go. You just listen to their instructions. If you do a good job listening to their instructions, you will do well. If you deviate from their instructions, you'll get in trouble. So we spend 13 plus years teaching kids like all of their interactions outside of the home with what they perceive as the real world, even though it's quite separate from the real world, is within an environment where you're just supposed to follow the rules. So how much of people's, like, I know this is an enormous question, but how much of this inability to withstand environments that are not that, do you think is actually innate within us versus a product of how we were taught to think? And if it's a product of how we were taught to think, that would imply that it's something that can be taught in a different way. Like we could both raise children to be more comfortable in unstructured and entrepreneurial environments, and also if you're a young person who is debating what to do with your life and which path is right, that it is perhaps a set of mindsets that can be learned, even if you weren't exposed to them up to this point in your life.
Right. So I do have a whole book on human genetics, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. I vaguely remember one or two papers on the genetics of entrepreneurship. I will say it's a personality trait, and so we should expect it to be like other personality traits, where it'll have a heritability somewhere between 0.4 and 0.6. That in itself, as to what it even means, well, it means that if you happen to have an identical twin and you got separated at birth, then we can go to a table and we can get a prediction about how, if you are at the 80th percentile of entrepreneurship, where should you expect your separated twin to be? But none of this is all that helpful in terms of trying to improve your life. You can say, look, a trait is highly heritable, and yet that doesn't mean that you can't go and change yourself if you are motivated to do so. So it's, I mean, like in terms of can you raise more entrepreneurial kids, generally what we see is that personality traits show very little influence of upbringing. Doesn't mean that there isn't some magic bullet treatment that would actually make a difference, just that it's very rarely applied if it does exist. Say the main thing here is when you see that parenting doesn't have much effect, one story is it's because parents can't matter. Another story is that parents just don't do anywhere near the dosage that would be required to actually get the difference. You can see this with something like language acquisition, where we just know that hardly anyone in America ever learns a foreign language from being taught in school. It does not mean that it is impossible to teach a foreign language. It just means that hardly anybody does anywhere close to the amount of studying that they would need and practice they need in order to actually get good. There is the question of, well, once you know how hard it is, do you still feel like doing it? For a language, I say probably don't. On the other hand, for something like making yourself more entrepreneurial, maybe that really is worth going and putting in 10 times the normal amount.
Today's episode is brought to you by the John Galt Mortgage Company. Anybody who knows me well knows that I'm a fan of Ayn Rand's novels. And so I was incredibly excited when I found out my friends were starting a mortgage company named after John Galt. And I was even more excited when I found out what that mortgage company does. My friends Mitch and Tim have been working in the real estate world for years, and they realized over time that mortgages are way more expensive than they need to be. So they decided to start a new kind of mortgage, one that caps their profit on every transaction and passes the savings along to you, the buyer, in the form of a lower interest rate. I am not currently in the market for a house, but when I am, I will absolutely be working with Mitch and Tim as my lender. And if you are in the market for a house, you should absolutely check out what they're doing and get a quote for the rates that they can offer you. You can find their work at www.johngaltmortgage.com, or you can find a link to their site down in the show notes. Okay, back to the show. What do you see as the relationship between deviating from the status quo path in K-12 education and deviating from the status quo path in higher education? What I mean by that is it's a very common phenomenon for people to be comfortable exiting the system, especially in elementary school with their kids. Like, it's very, very common for people to pull their kids out of public school, homeschool them in their elementary years, send them back for high school because they don't feel equipped to, deliver a full high school education. It's also very common for people to homeschool all the way through high school, but then the kids are still on a college trajectory, which to some of us in the education world feels very counterintuitive. It's like, well, if you can exit part of it, you can exit all of it, right? You don't have to do the whole thing. Do you feel like it's two very separate thought processes to decide to opt out of one versus the other? Because it sounds like, in terms, we're talking about this very practically, and we'll get to the economic thinking side of this in a minute, but we're talking very practically right now about just like from a statistical standpoint, these are the outcomes of going to college versus not going to college. Do you feel like it's a very different thing to weigh whether or not you want to opt out of K-12 and whether or not you want to opt out of college, or do you see them as being very akin?
I would say that K-8 is where the sky's the limit and no one will ever know what happened and what you did, so you can do anything you want.
Literally anything.
Yes. I think that's pretty much fair. Like K-8, it truly does not go on your permanent record. The rest of the world just has no clue what you did and they don't care, and it's just never going to come out. Once you are in high school, then there's an issue. I had started homeschooling my first two sons when they were in middle school. And part of my argument with my wife is like, nobody will ever have any idea we even did this. This is totally safe. Once we were wrapping up those 2 years, that's where I was getting nervous and saying, well, on the one hand, this is working out really well. On the other hand, am I really handicapping them for their future? And that's where I started trying to go and find out for college admissions what happens to kids that were homeschooled. I didn't want to just go and trust homeschooling advocates because I think they do tend to be rosy-eyed about this. Tried to find just boring, neutral quants who worked on it. And normally their story is there's at most mild discrimination against homeschoolers, which you can overcome if you do something really impressive. Top schools especially like what they call spiky kids who have some notable, unusual achievement of some kind. And it's a lot easier to do that when you're homeschooled. Homeschoolers can spike to a degree that's really hard for anybody else. Obviously, like child actors and athletes, they almost need to be homeschooled in order to do what they do. And that's how they're able to be so spiky, is because they just sacrifice other things in life in order to focus on that. So anyway, I would say that once you're starting high school, that's where you do need to think a bit harder about it. And then for college, this is where the real world does care. So employers almost never look at high school records. And actually, a fun fact about high school is that there have been experiments where people have tried to pretend to be employers to get high school records, and high schools just don't respond. The high schools are just like they are set up to respond to colleges, not to employers. So I mean, if you think about a typical job where they want a high school degree but not college, and then if you take like 7 months to respond to that request from an employer, they might as well have never responded actually. In terms of why college matters, again, it is because this is the gatekeeper that really matters for employment in the modern world.
I'm going to bring this back to like where we kind of already were for a minute, because I still want to drill into this degree being valuable in the labor market thing. Because
just one other thing.
Please.
So I don't know of any homeschoolers that homeschool for college. You could imagine we're college homeschoolers, but I don't know of anyone even trying to do that. It is one where it's like either we're done and you're going to go get a job and learn the real world, or we're going to go back to the system.
Have you ever heard of Goddard College in Vermont?
No.
It's this tiny little college that's basically like homeschooling through college. It's an accredited organization, but the way it's structured, you work with an advisor, but you create your own curriculum and you're doing your own projects. So I had friends who went through it who, like, one of them was running a farm that was doing like vegetable breeding projects and like preserving heirloom varieties of different fruits and vegetables. And he wanted the accreditation of having a degree, but he didn't want to be on the normal path. So he went through this program at Goddard College where he was able to design a whole curriculum around what he was doing. So there is a little bit of this homeschooling through college thing.
All right. That's the first I've heard of it.
but it's unusual. So I want to go back for a second to this idea that a college degree is a core factor in your perceived value on the job market, because it sounds like it's a very arbitrary thing, or sort of like a legacy thing that the whole system is built around and hasn't innovated beyond, but that is not actually terribly useful. Like if 80% of the value is merely the fact that you got the degree at the end, you got the sheepskin, that's highly indicative of the fact that you're not actually doing anything in school that is making you significantly more employable. It's merely an optics thing.
Well, but it's the whole reason, at least if my story is correct, is that there has to be on average a genuine bona fide difference between people who finish and those who don't, of a substantial degree. And especially you just had to be thinking about this from the point of view of employers. If it was really true that you could just go and pretty easily hire people without college degrees that would be just as good but cost a lot less than people who do have them, it's just hard to believe that wouldn't be happening already to a very high degree. I think the real story is that for a lot of employers, it's not like they are wondering, wow, there must be a ton of great people that don't even have degrees. It's more like there's a ton of bad people that do have degrees.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard enough to go and find the people that are good with degrees and to ask them to go into the other pool of people who don't even have degrees. It's like, well, gee, what in the world is going to be in that stack?
Right. The part that I'm trying to break down more is the fact that there's not anything magic that happens inside of a university building that can't be attained elsewhere.
Well, let's see. I guess the most magical thing, or the closest to magical thing, is the conformity signal. So what I explained in the case of education, all right, you've got one thing that you think when you meet an MIT grad, all right, real smart. All right, but we know there's really cheap ways of finding out if smart people are. They're called IQ tests. Then we've got, all right, hardworking, work ethic. All right, this is one where it's a bit harder to find out because you can't just say work for an hour and I'll watch how hard you work. People know there's really high stakes, they will fake it. But even there, you could still go and think of a bunch of other ways. So saying, well, like, what have you done with your life? Show me all the work you've done. That'll give me an idea of how hardworking you are. But this third thing of conformity, this is the one where it's really hard to go and innovate by definition, because if you come up with your incredible, novel, radical new way to show how conformist you are, there's what economists call adverse selection, who will be first in line for the radical alternative to the normal ways of showing conformity. It's going to be some nonconformists, actually, probably. And here's the thing. You might say, oh, no, nonconformists are great employees. A few are. Most aren't. Most nonconformists are just a pain in the neck. And most businesses, most don't even really want you to be an innovator. They want you to go and do something that works and that's known to work. Most people's ideas about how to improve things are wrong. But then on top of that, even out of places that do officially want creativity, and they kind of do, but it's creativity within a fairly narrow range. Google does not want people who are so creative that they say, hey, why are you the CEO and I'm the new worker? Well, how about I'm the CEO and you're the worker, right? It's creativity within the assigned range of tasks that they're looking for, right? So, and I will say that what we see is that anytime that people are signaling conformity, those signals are among the most stable. There's this painting from the University of Paris from I think you're 1200 AD, so 800 years ago. It looks like a modern classroom. The stuff has immense staying power. I will say, of course, a lot of it is the subsidies, but it's also that you don't want to be the first person doing something really strange in a world where people are trying to fit in, which they normally are, and for good reasons. People are building teams to go and work together, and normally, a person who's really different is a problem for that.
I want to talk a little bit about the spending inefficiencies of the education system as well, because education is a much more significant part of our GDP than the average person, I think, realizes.
Oh yeah, precisely because it's subsidized. You don't think about the subsidy as part of GDP, but it came from somewhere.
Can you talk a little bit about this? Because it is, and there I can give you a slightly more specific angle to riff on. So I think there are two things about this that are really interesting. One is just the raw amount that we are spending on education in this country, and then the gross inefficiency of that, because where is all this is a significant part of our GDP.
Oh, yeah.
Where is all this money going?
Right. So if you read, let's see, I think it's like chapter 8 of, or maybe it's chapter 7 of the Case Against Education. I go over all the numbers circa 2015. So it's a bit out of date, but back then, all levels of government and individuals were spending over $1 trillion a year on education.
$1 trillion a year.
Yes. Now it's going to be a lot more. There's been a lot of inflation since then. So it's going to be quite a bit more than that.
At the time, that was like 5% of our GDP.
Yeah, 5 or 6% of GDP total. Of course, a lot of that is K-12, but then college is, I think, at least close to half, actually. Maybe it's like 40%. I'm just going from memory. In terms of what's going on, think about this. There's your tuition plus all the subsidies. So if you're like, tuition seems like a lot, but then you pile on this other stuff. As for where it's going, just walk around and see what's happening on campuses. Some of it, of course, is on instruction. A lot of it is on the administration, on the bureaucracy. There's definitely people who try to defend the bureaucracy and say how incredibly useful it is. I think that, especially in the nonprofit sector, you should be real skeptical of claims like that and trust your direct observation when you see there's 100 people that don't seem to do anything other than respond to each other's requests for other paperwork. Probably those people actually are really not providing value. Sometimes you might say, well, they have to do this because there's another bureaucracy that requires them to do it. It's okay, so maybe they're useful in the context of there being some useless rules and they help you get around it. But at the broader perspective, it's all pretty much a waste. Then there's a bunch of other crazy things like a ton of spending on athletics that hardly anybody is interested in. George Mason has this giant aquatic center. And I'm like, who has ever gone to a swim meet other than family members of the team? So there's that. You probably know about Title IX. There's not even a regulation. There's this bizarre interpretation of a law, which then says that we need to have equal numbers of male and female athletes, even though women are much less interested in doing athletics. So we need to create a bunch of fake teams and then have women go and show up once a year so that we can go and meet this quota. There's a bunch of weird stuff like that going on. But yeah, and then obviously there's just a bunch of ridiculous majors. So which usually we classify them under the grievance studies category. It's a good category of where it's like, well, we're going to do women's studies. And what do we do here? Well, we talk about issues of women. And it's like, so what's the debate exactly? And it's like, the debate is not, have women been mistreated on average or not? The debate is just like, we all agree on the basic doctrines of the faith. And now we're going to go and do fine theological points of the details. So yeah, these are fields where they're fake in the sense that essentially the answers are foregone conclusions. There's nobody in the fields that says there's just something basically wrong with our field. So yeah, that's another part where the money's going.
How do you feel about the school choice movement? Can we talk about this for a little bit?
Yep.
I hear very strong arguments on both sides. I've had very strong arguments on both sides here on the show. I'm really excited to hear your brief summation of like, do you think this is going to help the problem? Do you think this is going to drive some free market innovation that's going to perhaps put the fire to the feet of the education system as we know it and force them to become a little bit more efficient as money starts leaking out? What's your stance on this?
Right. So I've always been sympathetic, although at the same time, when I wrote the case against education, I said, look, the main problem is just we're spending way too much money. School choice, it does go and at least give people some options, but same time, it does not go and handle this problem of the rat race, of this credential inflation, of people just trying to go and get more education than other people in order to get a job. I really did change my mind about this during COVID because I saw this amazing fact, which is that almost every private school in America reopened the second it was legal to do it. Whereas public schools generally drag their feet and often for years, essentially, especially with teachers' unions, but they just tried to avoid opening. They tried to push it down for as long as possible. And this really brought out the fact that, first of all, one of the main functions of K-12 is providing daycare. And second of all, that the public education system is so dysfunctional, they will take all your money and then not even give you freaking daycare. Whereas competition in private schools was sufficient to get them to reopen. So that was a pretty impressive difference. Early on, people were saying, oh, it's not about law or anything. It's just nobody wants to be in person. And I'm like, I think there's a lot of parents who want to be in person again. This is not convenient for them. The risk is real low. And I would say that private education really came out with flying colors almost over the whole entire country of showing that when parents want something, they will give it. That said, there's not that much difference in curriculum between public and private schools, I think mostly because parents don't care that much about the curriculum. What they care about primarily is whether there's some daycare. And that was what we saw during COVID.
What are the biggest levers that you would want to see pulled as someone who's been deep, you're obviously working deep within the education system, but you're thinking about it from the perspective of an economist. So you're thinking about it from much more perhaps objective terms in terms of costs and benefits and what's going where. What are the biggest levers that you would want to see pulled to make meaningful change and to start improve? I know you talk about this in the book and stuff, but if you can summarize your current thinking on this, what are the most important things that you would want to see change?
My big favorite word is austerity. I know it's a word that usually demonstrators have on their sign saying, don't have austerity. I'm like, good, wrong view on the topic, but it's a great word. Austerity just means think hard before spending taxpayer money. And to me, austerity is like in the 80s, I asked my dad, can I have $10? What do you need it for? What are you going to do with it? What happened to the last money? These are the questions that one should always ask if you were a steward of other people's money. And these are questions that are almost never asked today. So I would say cutting spending, cutting government spending. Also for donors, I'd say, look, this is probably a very bad use of their money. There are way better philanthropies to consider. So cut that. That's where I would focus on. In terms of the details of philanthropy, the details of the austerity. I mean, I'm open to all kinds of austerity. Whatever, any austerian idea, let's just give it a try. Let's try them all. Right now, I would say I'm real sympathetic to how about we just get rid of the really fake departments and say, look, we're not going to go and have taxpayers going and funding weird religions in the guise of scholarship when there's no real scholarship going on. So there's that.
What are those? Can you elaborate on the departments you would
like
defund?
I said, so starting with grievance studies. So ethnic studies, gender studies, sexuality studies, these are just fake departments. These are ones where if you don't believe in that religion, you cannot be there. And most of what they're doing is just preaching a religion, right? In the most pejorative sense of the word religion, right? It's a pile of nonsense that they that they treat as proven fact.
Mm-hmm.
So for taxpayers to fund this stuff, I think is ridiculous. I mean, we really are in a position where if government had been funding institutes of creation science for the last 50 years and someone said, let's kick them off campus, and someone said that violates academic freedom, it's like, look, no, funding them violates academic freedom because you are making everyone pay for a freaking religion, right? It's like having your Catholic studies or whatever. It's like, this is not real research. What they're teaching is just nonsense. We're not punishing one individual for one controversial thing that they're saying. We're saying taxpayers are just not going to go and fund fields that produce no knowledge.
What about in terms of the education system, more broadly speaking, but like K all the way through higher education? You've been in the education field for a very long time.
I have not been out of school since I was 5 years old.
What grade are you in now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess the answer is that I am now in 47th grade.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
What have you noticed a difference in incoming students as a professor now versus when you first started working as a professor? Or like, what are the biggest differences that you're noticing in terms of the academic rigor that students are being put through in university? Is there a difference at all? And if there is, what has changed in your time as a professor?
I know a lot of professors of my generation just want to say, oh, things have gotten so much worse. My view is, look, they were always bad. They're bad now. We're talking about marginal changes. It's not a transformation of a once incredibly noble, productive system full of the free exchange of ideas into what we have now. It was always corrupt. It was always messed up, always full of dogma from everything I've ever seen. My own university has improved in quality over time, so I think that probably swamps what you would be seeing at the aggregate level. The main change that we really know about is how bad the ideological bias of universities has gotten. So what we can say is that if we go back to our earliest data, then there would be very large ideological imbalances already, with obviously left-wing ideology being a lot more common. But still in the 80s, it would be probably something like maybe 4 Democrats for a Republican. And again, not those are the only views, but it is a nice metric that is comprehensible in the outside world just to see, because if a professor says a moderate, well, what, are you a moderate Marxist or a moderate compared to a normal person? So anyway, you probably see something like a 4-to-1 faculty, Democrat-Republican ratio in the 80s, and now it probably would be getting close to 20-to-1. All right, so in my own field of economics, I know in 1996, it would have been something like 3 Democrats for every 2 Republican, but now it would be more like 4 or 5-to-1, and if you look at the youngest professors, then probably more like 10-to-1. So it really is the case that we've gone from one where there was a tiny core of dissent to almost nothing. So it was never a vigorous marketplace of ideas. It was never a time when there were at least two views. I mean, of course, ideally there'd be more than two freaking views, but there was never a time when there were two views that were roughly equally well-manned, and then there was a vigorous debate between them. It was always one where there's a heavy bias. Many people say, well, it's just selection. I'd say that there's actually a lot of evidence of explicit, conscious political discrimination in academia as well. I think that, it really is the level of, it's like we establish a Catholic church and then wonder why we don't have non-Catholics in the church. It's like, well, given that they're so overwhelming and that they consider all their views to be not even worthy debating, not too surprising that the imbalance not only persists, but gets worse over time.
Can you talk a little bit? You have a new book coming out very soon. Can you, which I think will be of high interest to the audience that listens to this show, can you give us the teaser for what this book is about?
Yeah, so I've been doing books of essays based upon my very favorite blog posts from the last 20 years. Essentially, I try to get about the best 5% of my essays that I wrote over this period, and then I organize them by topic. So the fifth book in the series is going to be called You Will Not Stampede Me, Essays on Nonconformism. And it collects all of my essays about nonconformism. I definitely self-identify as a nonconformist. I always have. At the same time, as you might have gathered from me talking about signaling conformity, I'm aware that there is something functional about conformity, and I understand why employers are not that thrilled to go and hire nonconformists. But what I say in the book is I try to go and help my fellow nonconformists and explain how they can go and not only not suffer as a result of their nonconformism, but turn it into something that is valuable. A lot of the advice really is to be strategic about it and say, look, I don't have to be nonconformist on everything all the time. I can go and make some compromises with the world. I can try to find out what are the things that actually matter and what are the things where it really doesn't make any difference for anything, or at least it was very unlikely to make any difference.
Amazing.
Right. So, what I'm going to tell you is amazing. It's not amazing yet. But some of the main things, like pay attention to whether or not other people that you need the support of are paying any attention. I've long been someone who just dresses for comfort. And I remember my dad would say, well, nobody else is wearing shorts, Brian. I'm like, yeah, well, are these people going to give me a job? Are these people my friends? And they're not going to like me anymore? It's like, no, then I'm going to do what I want because they're strangers and it doesn't make any difference. This is a modern anonymous society. So a lot of what intelligent nonconformity is about is realizing, all right, well, I'm living in a modern anonymous society. It's very different from the one that human beings evolved in, which means there's an enormous range within which I can just live my own life, march the beat of my own drummer, and nothing bad will ever happen to me. But I do need to keep my eyes open for counterexamples to that rule. So anything that impinges on the labor market, that's one where you got to be more careful. Right. So, yeah, if I were going to interview, I'd wear a suit. I wouldn't dress for comfort for the interview. If you're the kind of nonconformist, I will never bend the knee to anyone for any reason. I can't help you. That's not going to get you. That's going to go and mess up your life. But you can be a 95% nonconformist. And then on the 5%, this is where I'm going to go and compromise on these remaining issues. So actually, education is one where I'll say that if you really want to do the thing where you just don't do school, right, there is a way out, but if you are a nonconformist, you actually can remain very true to yourself while doing very well in school. You just have to look for the right majors that are tolerant to that kind of thing. Do CS, do economics. These are high-paid majors, which then funnel you into high-paid jobs that also don't have such high conformity expectations. So would definitely encourage those things. Let's see. Other areas where it really matters. Honestly, also say blood relatives normally are super forgiving. Right, so your parents may not like that you're not a conformist or that you won't do what they say, but the number of parents that will actually go and crack down on you for doing what you want is, I think, very low. I'm not encouraging people to go and steal from their parents or otherwise abuse them, but if you think your parents are being unreasonable, there's generally super safe. You know your parents better, but it's generally super safe to say, yeah, I'll take that under advisement, and then you keep doing what you want, and the odds that they will actually push back real small. Even as a parent, I notice, there's a lot of people when they're parents, they think, I've got to go for my child's sake, I've got to go and fit in. I'm always telling people is, look, most people are too stressed out by their own parenting to worry about your parenting. The idea that like no one will play with your kid because you're weird, like that's really fanciful. There's hardly anybody that actually is even paying that much attention to what you're doing as a parent. So you really can quite safely, with your kid's best interest at heart, still keep living as you think best.
If people found this interview interesting, and I imagine they have, you have an extensive body of work scattered in a number of places. Where would you send people next to find more of what you do?
All right, so Amazon has all my books, and you can even get them extra cheap, just buy them used. So feel free to do that. I've got, 2 University Press books, Myth of the Rational Voter and Case Against Education, both with Princeton University Press. So that's a very prestigious signal. I've got my popular science book, which has done more to improve the world than all of my other stuff put together, which is Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. I am a big natalist, and this book, I've got good evidence that hundreds of extra kids exist because of this book. So that's the one that has actually improved the world because it's self-help, and you don't need to convince a lot of people to convince. You don't need to convince anything close to a majority to have a lot of people benefit from it. I've got my nonfiction graphic novel, Open Borders, the Science and Ethics of Immigration. I've got my 4 previous books of essays out already. Then I've got my blog which is Bet On It on Substack, which has now a full 20 years worth of archives. So if you want to read every single thing I ever wrote, you can just start today. It's like 5,000 pages worth of stuff, or actually probably a lot more than that now that I think about it. Let's see. So all of the 8 books, when they're done, that will come out to almost 2,000 pages. So, and that's like the top 5%. So yeah, it's probably like 30 or 40,000 pages worth of stuff when you really add it up. So that's what I've been doing with my life.
Amazing. Yeah, I'll link to all of this in the show notes
All right,
too for listeners. Thank you so much for taking the time for this. I know you have a busy schedule on this trip. I appreciate you making time for me. This was super fun.
All right. Thanks a lot. Great fun, Hannah.
All right, that's a wrap for this week. Thank you so much for being here. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, please leave a 5-star rating. Ratings are how this show gets discovered by other people, and it helps me bring in better guests. And no matter where you're listening, please like and subscribe to the show to make sure you don't miss a future episode. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you next week.